Good morning and happy Tuesday, virtual learners. So today we're going to read another fairy tale, just like we did yesterday. And I want us to really pay attention to the details today. Not only because I want you to be able to tell me what happened first in the story, second in the story, third in the story, that sort of thing. But what we find with fairy tales is a lot of the times you'll have people retell them, but they might change them a little bit. So one of the skills that we're going to work on this week and the next week is we're going to look at how can we compare and contrast two different versions of the same story. Now, when I say compare and contrast, that means how are they the same and how are they different? So we're going to read a more traditional version of Little Red Riding Hood today. Then tomorrow, we're going to read another version that's a little bit different. And I want to see if we can come up with some ways of how they're the same and how they're different. Are you ready to begin? Little Red Riding Hood. Many years ago, there lived an industrious woodman and his wife, and one little girl named Rosie. Rosie was a very pretty little child, and so bright and so merry that no one could help loving her. She was a favorite because of her sweet disposition. Even her old grandmother, who was rather cross and not as a rule fond of children, made quite a pet of Rosie. Dear old Granny, as she was called by her granddaughter, lived in a rustic cottage about a mile from the village, but fine or wet, scarcely a day passed without seeing the little maiden sitting on a stool in the old lady's cottage, listening to the wonderful stories which Granny said had happened long ago when she was a little girl. When Rosie's birthday came, her grandmother gave her a pretty red cloak with a hood of the same color. The bright hue pleased the child, and she put the cloak on at once, looking prettier than ever. And Granny did smile as the little mite peeped on tiptoe to get a good view of herself in the glass. That means the mirror. She certainly did make a pretty picture. Rosie grew so fond of her pretty red cloak that she always wore it, and the neighbors gave her the name of Little Red Riding Hood. I've told you what an engaging child Red Riding Hood was, but like all children, she had her faults. And one of these was a bad habit of inattention. Without meaning to be disobedient, she sometimes got into scrapes by only half listening while her mother was speaking to her. That's never happened to you guys, has it? I bet it never does. You always listen, right? One day, her granny was taken very ill, and after that, Little Red Riding Hood's mother used to go to her house very often with nice things for her. But one day, it happened that she was not able to make her usual visit. So Little Red Riding Hood's mother called to her, saying, I am too busy to see Granny, so I want you to take her some wine, soup, fresh butter, and new laid eggs. Go at once and be sure you do not talk to anyone that you meet. You can come in, Mrs. Baker. Do not dawdle on the way, for Granny will be glad to see you, and you must be back before sunset. Now, one thing I'm noticing right away is this story doesn't have very many pictures. Rosie only half listened to what her mother said, and having put on her red cloak, she went away with a big basket on her arm, thinking how delightful to scamper through the woods with her little dog would be. On her way, she came across an old woodman taking a rest, who warned her not to stray into the woods for fear of the wolves which infested the neighborhood. It so happened that a wicked wolf overheard these remarks and trotted off smiling and thinking how he could entrap Little Red Riding Hood. It was the most beautiful day, and Rosie, quite forgetful of her mother's wishes, loitered about and was very much taken with her hair as she was sitting up and washing her face. But when she saw the dog was soon off. A little farther on, she saw a pretty little bright-eyed squirrel cracking a nut on the bough of a tree. She ran about where all of the prettiest flowers were growing and gathered a lovely bouquet for her grandmother. When she was tired of running about and swinging on the branches, she sat down to rest, and then the sly old wolf came up and began to talk in a friendly manner. Rosie told him she was going to see her grandmother, who lived in a little red cottage close to the village. "Let's have a race," said the wolf. "You go that way and I'll go this way and see who can get there first, as I'm going quite close to there." I don't know that she should trust this wolf. What do you think? Red Riding Hood thought that it would be very fun, so she and the wolf started off by different paths. As soon as Red Riding Hood was out of sight, the wolf set off at a tremendous rate, and running with all his might, he very soon arrived at Granny's cottage, which he recognized from the description Red Riding Hood had given him. He knocked gently at the door. "Who's there?" said Grandmother. "It's I, Granny dear," said the cunning wolf, making his voice as like Little Red Riding Hood's as he could. "Pull the bobbin, and that will lift the latch, my dear," said Granny. The wolf did so and opened the door. The poor old lady was lying helpless and ill in bed, and the cruel wolf no sooner caught sight of her than he made a spring and ate her up in 2 mouthfuls. Then the crafty animal dressed himself up in poor Granny's things, admired himself in the glass, chuckled, and got into bed, pulling the sheets around his neck. When the wolf left Little Red Riding Hood, the little girl too set off briskly, but she soon began to dawdle again, and this time passed quickly as she loitered on the road, picking more flowers. The consequence was that once she did not arrive at her grandmother's cottage until a good hour after the wolf, thus giving him plenty of time to completely disguise himself. As Red Riding Hood came to the cottage door, a voice from inside cried, "Is that you, dear grandchild?" "Yes, Granny." "Pull the bobbin and lift the latch, my dear," said the wolf, imitating Granny's voice as much as possible. "Thank you, my dear," said the wolf in a weak voice. "But if you..." Oh, I skipped part of it. Eek. She did this, going in on tiptoe, lest she should disturb Granny and make her worse. "Poor Granny," said Red Riding Hood. "What a bad cold you have. I brought you some soup to make you better. Shall I make some hot for you at once?" "Thank you, my dear," said the wolf in a weak voice, "but I like you better than soup." Red Riding Hood bustled about preparing her grandmother's supper. At last she drew near the bed and noticed for the first time how very strange her grandmother looked. "What large eyes you have, Granny," said the child. "The better to see you with." "My dear," said the wolf with a grin. "And Granny, how long your ears have grown." "The better to hear you, my dear." "And oh, Granny, what sharp teeth you have." "The better to eat you," cried the wolf. But just at that moment, a dog's bark was heard. The door burst open, and in rushed the old woodman, whose attention had been attracted by the little dog's frantic barking. The cowardly wolf let go of his Red Riding Hood, and he tried to make an escape, but the woodman set upon him and soon killed him. As for Little Red Riding Hood, she was more frightened than hurt. The woodman carried her home to her mother, a very repentant little girl. That means she was sorry for her actions. She had learned a lesson which she never forgot, and after this, when she saw any children inclined to be disobedient, she told them as a warning her own story of Little Red Riding Hood and the wolf. And that's the end of our story. So that was a more traditional telling of the story. So I want you to see what kind of details you can remember from the story and keep those in your brain. You can write about them in your journal, or you can write about something else in your journal, but keep those details in mind, because tomorrow we'll read a different version of the story and we'll begin to look at how they're the same and how they're different. Okay? Don't forget to do your morning songs, and I will post other activities for you to do in Seesaw today. See you guys soon. Bye.